Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. Shall we go to Vancouver and maybe to Fredericton, New Brunswick today? That would be a good thing. So we'll bring both ends of our continent together and talk with two people who are concerned about nuclear matters. I shouldn't tip you off because this is a schmooze day, which means everybody gets to talk about whatever's on their mind. And often we get surprised because people talk about things that, not their usual beat. Ramana, MD Ramana, is a professor and Simons Chair of Disarmament and Global and Human Security at the School of Public Policy in UBC. And he is director of the Liu Institute for Global Issues. And he's also involved with South Asian research. So good morning, Ramana.
Good morning to you, and to Doug and to Susan.
Yes, and to Susan. I'm about to introduce Susan. Susan O'Donnell is a sociologist, it turns out, and we have something in common. And she's at the University of New Brunswick, and she has also has worked a long time at the National Research Council. I guess that's in Ottawa, isn't it? Yeah.
In Fredericton.
Is it in Fredericton? Okay,
yes.
So you
all across Canada, we have a unit in Fredericton.
All right. Okay, so now the thing is, I know a little bit about what you're likely to be interested in, but I'm not going to persuade you to talk about that. You can talk about whatever you want. I want to introduce Doug Saunders, who is the international affairs columnist for the Globe and Mail. I say the international affairs columnist. Maybe you have more than one. I don't know.
It's pretty. It's not a staff of thousands.
So you cover the entire world single-handed. It's marvelous.
We have a lot of reporters as well, but yeah.
Okay, you're supposed to know everything. Well, that's kind of encyclopedic wisdom is what we need today. Okay, I'll tell you what. Doug, why don't you're really good at this. You can always ask the right questions to get things going provocatively. So what would you like for Susan and Ramana to talk about today?
This week, actually, I'd like to just hear what you'd like to talk about, because although I think you have some overlapping interests and specialties, I'm curious to hear about them. So let's leave this one open.
Okay. Susan, why don't you lead off and tell us what's on your mind these days?
Absolutely. Well, Doug, I have to say that I recognize your name because when you were the European correspondent, and I used to live in Europe, I used to read your columns with interest. But what I remembered recently was your column on Fukushima, which I profoundly disagreed with.
I thought you might.
So I thought that would be a really interesting conversation, because you believe that one of the lessons of Fukushima is that we need to double down on building new nuclear reactors, whereas I believe that that's profoundly not the way we need to be going. And so that could be something we could talk about. I don't know if that would interest you.
I'd like to hear about it. I should say my position wasn't a pro-nuclear position as much as it was to look at the lessons of Fukushima in an environment where no carbon power solutions are going to be needed urgently at very large scale. And Fukushima was almost ideal because it was a test of the very worst reactor ever designed in the very worst location. You could put a reactor exposed to the very worst possible circumstances and the very least competent staff, and yet it still produced the reactor itself caused no deaths. If there'd been a hydroelectric generator there would have been tens of thousands of deaths.
I think Ramana might want to comment on that, but it's caused huge community displacement and destruction, obviously. And
the tsunami did, yes.
No. So I think, it is definitely not the worst possible accident. We've seen worst possible accidents, including at Chernobyl, all right? And it is not about the reactor design per se, right? Nuclear power plants people have studied this for a long time, including the famous sociologist Charles Perrow, whose book called Normal Accidents sort of showed how all nuclear plants have these very fundamental characteristics which you cannot avoid, which he called tight coupling and interactive complexity, right? And this means that you can never predict in what pathways you can end up with an accident. So Fukushima was one pathway, Chernobyl is another pathway. Any reactor will have a pathway through which it can have one of these accidents. So that's the first thing. The second is, nobody would say that Japan runs its plants badly. Japan has a pretty good staff, okay? There's a lot of problems there. I'm not doubting that, and we know a lot about it. And we know a lot about it, the problems with the way it was run, precisely because that Japan has been very well studied. If you studied Canada the same way, if you studied Mexico the same way, you will find lots of problems there as well, right? You cannot say, this country runs its plants worse than the others, because there are no real metrics as such. You cannot measure how badly somebody is running, right? You can see there's a problem here. The regulator is compromised. Regulators are compromised in many countries, right? You can see that, the location is a problem. You will see locations are problems in, for example, the United States, right? We had plants which have been close to getting flooded, right? We have plants which are being constructed in earthquake zones, right? And so that's not something which is going to be unique to Japan. And the last thing I would say is that it is not true that Fukushima caused 0 deaths, right? There was a large amount of radiation released, unless you happen to believe, and against all evidence, that there's a limit below which radiation does not cause damage. You have to say that there are going to be a certain number of people who are going to develop cancers and a bunch of other health effects, right? And the way that many of these international agencies say that no deaths is by presuming that below a certain level, there are going to be no deaths, right? So, sorry, I sort of have to disagree on all the 3 points.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
the tsunami was enormously damaging. There's no question about that. But that doesn't mean that a nuclear plant did not cause damage. And the other thing which I should say is there's a difference between a hydroelectric dam and a nuclear plant, which is that the damage from a hydroelectric dam failure would be fairly localized, right? It's going to be downstream of the plant, right? Here, there's a much larger region and it's a much longer time frame, right? There are parts of Belarus and Ukraine which still are not inhabitable.
Yeah.
And
radiation damage is of a different character in the sense that it's transmissible through the generations. It's not just something where you get sick and maybe die of it, but you pass it on. And that, to me, is the terrible thought.
Although in Fukushima, after a decade, they have not detected any. In the immediate county, it's certainly none beyond.
I'm gonna leave it to that point, maybe to Romana, who might be aware of follow-up studies, if indeed there have been, which is always a problem, the lack of follow-up. But I think the point that where I diverged with your main point, and you just reiterated it there, Doug, is the immediacy, because the problem, as I see it, is we have even if everything was wonderful with nuclear, and even if it was, the best thing, if you believed all the nuclear spin about how it's just so wonderful, etc., even if it was that, we couldn't possibly build enough nuclear reactors quickly enough to deal with the climate crisis, because we're in an emergency right now. Like in New Brunswick, for example, I mean, the CANDUs have not been successful, or they would have been proposing to build new ones. They're absolutely not. And so now they're on to these small modular reactors, and we have 2 of them proposed for New Brunswick. If they can get the billions of dollars of public funds that they need to build them, it will probably take 20 years before we find out if they even work. And we don't even have that kind of time. So putting aside all the safety concerns, et cetera, we just absolutely don't have the time right now to build new nuclear. That's where I fundamentally disagreed with your conclusion from.
So is this that untested a technology that it would take 20 years on top of the normal construction time?
Well, these are old.
Because certainly small nuclear reactors have a large history. I mean, there were marker buoys in the St. Lawrence River that had nuclear power. my father and mother went to McMaster University in the 50s, and they lived in a dorm that was heated using a small nuclear reactor. It's not, the small scale fusion is not untested.
No, it's been tried before, and then that's why they moved to big reactors because of the small reactors not working so well, and so now they're bringing back the small reactors. So I know Ramana knows a lot more about the history than I do, but yes, the two reactors, for example, the ones proposed in New Brunswick, molten salt reactor and a sodium cooled reactor, they do not have good solid histories in terms of where they've been deployed in the past and the accidents and why they haven't been built before. And now they're proposing new ones. They're completely one of a kind new designs. And yes, it will take 20 years to build them if they can indeed come up with the money. And as I say, they don't even know if they can work safely because of the small size. They're not, heavy water reactors like the CANDUs. They're a whole different design, and they create a whole new set of inherent safety features. And so they're very, very complex designs, and they're going to take a long time. And we just don't have that kind of time. Is my
What's the better alternative for decarbonizing New Brunswick's power grid as quickly as possible, assuming that
okay,
there'll need to be a large increase in output?
Well, we're really lucky here in New Brunswick, as Ontario is, because we're next door to Quebec. So what we need to do, and they have an excess of hydropower, right? And so what we need to do is improve the transmission between the provinces. And in fact, we were able to do that when LaPro was shut down for 4 years during its refurbishment. It opened up again in 2012. We depended on hydropower from Quebec to make up that loss. It's currently about 35% of our power in New Brunswick is provided by the LaPro reactor. It was down for 40 days this winter, in the coldest part of the winter. And again, we had to make that up somehow. We have agreements with Quebec Hydro, for example, and we can do that again. So for sure.
Does that mean that New Brunswick, because New Brunswick is one of the most carbon heavy grids in among Canadian provinces, as far as I understand, does that mean that New Brunswick could have been getting rid of coal all along simply by bringing in power from Great Whale?
Yeah, okay, I'm actually not familiar with the other provinces, but I don't believe we're the most carbon intensive.
Saskatchewan is probably the most.
Saskatchewan.
Yeah. The prairie provinces are even more serious. Alberta's not great either, right, as far as I understand.
Our basic problem, if you will, in terms of decarbonization and moving to better energy generation technologies in New Brunswick, is that our utility, NB Power, is hardwired for nuclear. It just is hardwired for nuclear.
And for fossil fuels.
And for fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of political reasons for that. And that's what we're trying to shake right now. And that's why I'm active in a coalition trying to shake that up.
So I'd like to add that I think, it's wrong to assume that nuclear will replace coal, right? Nuclear and fossil fuels go together by and large. So if you look at, for example, the United States, right? All of the utilities in the United States that own nuclear plants also have large fossil fuel interests, right? Exelon, Duke, Southern, any of them, right? And they have all been, if you look at their lobbying record, their record for what kind of legislations they have supported or opposed, they've typically said, we don't want rapid climate change mitigation, right? Because that is going to affect their financial interest. So I think it's wrong to sort of posit somehow that nuclear is going to come and replace fossil fuels. What's really happening is that new nuclear are sort of coming in the way of no renewables. Right? And renewables is something which most of us agree are going to be part of the solution, whether we like it or not. Right? That's going to be the biggest chunk.
Now, Ramana, what I usually hear from green power advocates is that wind and solar are natural partners for nuclear because it provides the backstop during that you really can't have unless you have a large hydroelectric facility, you can't really have a solar and wind grid unless you have a nuclear backstop.
That's not true. So let me explain. So
Mhm.
first of all, nuclear would be a very unnatural backstop. And the reason is that by and large, nuclear plants, partly because of technology and partly because of economics, operate as what are called baseload plants, which means that they have a flat output, right? Now, you think about it. So let's say you are going to have many climate models and so on will try to say that you have to have roughly about a third of your electricity coming from renewables, third of your power coming from nuclear. These are sort of or sort of agnostic, shall we say, and third coming from fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. Okay. Now, whatever it is, doesn't matter. So let's say it's a third of the electricity. Electricity by which I mean kilowatt hours. All right. If you have to have a third of your electricity coming from solar or wind, you have to have enough capacity of wind and solar to be essentially making all of the power at some times of the year, right? You have to overbuild in solar and wind, and that's not a problem because these have become so cheap, right? So there are going to be times in the year or in the day when you're producing so much electricity from solar or wind that everything else has to be shut down, which means that they will no longer be baseload, right? So you'll have to shut down everything else. What you have to have as a complement to something which is variable like solar and wind is a source of power that can ramp up and ramp down quickly, right? Hydro fits that bill, right? Batteries are also, they're not a source of power, but they are a way that can ramp up and ramp down very quickly.
Do we have that technology at this point, though? I don't think we have storage.
No. So we do have. So the large parts of the world where storage is still an incomplete story, as are all these other things, right? But the rate at which storage has been increasing, the rate at which their costs have been declining, are a far more promising direction than nuclear. The last thing I want to say is people have been modeling grids for a long time, right? And in the last 20 years, you can see how this modeling process has changed. So if you had taken a model in, let's say, 2005, what you would see is that they would say, once the proportion of solar and wind go above around 30%, then the grid will become unstable. And therefore, we need a backup for all of the other things. Those models today have changed, and they say up to about 80 to 90%, we have no problem, right? And the huge study which came out just a month ago, from a joint study between NRCan and NREL, the National Resources and Energy Laboratory, National Renewable Energy Laboratory in Colorado, which showed that you can do up to 90% with no problem, okay? No problem is not no problem, means that the cost of trying to back up the remaining power is relatively small, okay?
So what would your critique be of the Ontario grid then, which is very close to zero carbon? It's between 0% and 4% renewables, depending what day and what time of day, and relies on about 60% fusion as its base load, and a growing proportion of wind and solar supported by that base load. What's the critique of that grid, aside from its cost and the corruption involved in creating it?
So the critique is twofold. First of all, I think nuclear fission, as I said, does not back up wind. All right, it is a base load, and you can. So here's the thing, that demand is something which is changing all the time. Demand is not a base load. Demand changes with time, changes of the time of the year, the time of the day, right? So we need a source of supplying this, which can also vary with time, right? If you have a kind of quote unquote base load source, which used to be the traditional way by which grids were managed, they would be either nuclear or coal. And then in the 90s, combined cycle natural gas plants started doing that. In some parts of the country, like in British Columbia, hydropower does that, right? And then on top of it, you have to have something which varies to try and meet the ups and the downs, all right? Now, when you start having more and more wind or solar, that whole model has to be turned away, and you have to come up with a different way of trying to meet that, right? And the reason is exactly what I said. Because of the variability of solar and wind, you have to have source of power that can step in when these things are not generating and step out when these are generating a lot. And the reason you want them to step out is because unlike any other source of power except hydro, wind and solar have what is called zero marginal cost, which is that all of the costs are essentially capital costs. Once you set up a solar plant, all you basically need is somebody to go with a squeegee to sort of clean up the thing or change the acid in the batteries and stuff like that. So relatively small cost. Same with wind, right? So when they're generating, you might as well use it because you're essentially getting each of those kilowatt hours for free after your initial cost. So once you come to a grid where there's even a significant percentage of solar and wind, you cannot do it with other baseload sources. You have to come up with a different model altogether. And there have been many places which have been trying to do that, right? So there are sort of three ways by which you can try to balance intermittency. One is by having these flexible source of power like hydro and so on. Second is by using storage. Third is by adding transmission to other parts of the country where, because the wind is not blowing here, maybe it's blowing in the prairies. And the last thing is to change the way your demand sort of functions, right? What they call demand response. So if you could change when you run your dishwasher or when a certain car battery is charged and so on and so forth. So there are many ways of doing that. So Ontario, unfortunately, has to be completely redesigned in a way because it has this big nuclear component. And the biggest critique of that is those nuclear plants at some point will have to be shut down, right? Or you're risking a big accident at some point, right? Nuclear plants become more susceptible to accidents either in the beginning of the life cycle or at the end of the lifetime, right? And so those things are huge costs, right? So right now, Ontario is spending $26 billion trying to refurbish these plants. If you wanted to actually redesign the grid from start, today the cheapest way would be to actually go fully renewable, backed up by hydro, and backed up with a small amount of batteries and so on and so forth, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Can I hear more about storage? Because my understanding, and I'm certainly not on the cutting edge of the industry, is that the only form of storage available at the gigawatt or terawatt scale today is to do what Niagara Falls does and pump a lot of water up into a lake to store it and then run it down through a turbine. You could use a nuclear power plant or something, or I should say a solar or wind facility to pump that water up as storage. But I don't think we have battery storage at gigawatt or terawatt scale now, do we?
I'm just gonna because I know you know about this, Romana.
But go ahead.
And I don't, but I was going to say, I know that Quebec Hydro is looking at that with their extra capacity storage in something similar to what, but I don't know much about it, what Doug is talking about. And again, it's a question of being plugged into, if we had some kind of a national grid, a national energy grid, that we could tap into these storage capacities where they are and where they potentially naturally exist. That's, I think, what we should be talking about. But go ahead, Romana.
I've done so many interviews about related topics. And one of them was with a guy named Michael Barnard in Vancouver, who is, he talked about things like green hydrogen and a bunch of other battery type solutions, storage solutions. But the one that he seemed most enthusiastic about is very, very simple. It is the pumped water storage, because he says, we know how to do this very, very well. And he showed maps of all over the world where there are such facilities. And there are almost countless other places where you can do the same thing. All you need is a body of water that's of a differential height from something else, up on top of a mountain or someplace like that. One good place would be where they're taking all of the coal off the tops of mountains and living these terrible scarred pits in coal mining regions, and you could just fill those with water and pump it up and down, and you'd give. But he seemed to feel it was just an abundance of possibilities for solving the problem that way. No problem, he said. And by the way, while I've got you the floor, I want to mention the fact that just a few days ago, I did an interview with Grigory Yachko, who used to be the the head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in the US in the Obama administration. And he has, I think his book is called something like Confessions of a Rogue Nuclear Regulator, because he was kind of hired because Reed of Nevada was worried about the Yucca Mountain thing and wanted to have some regulatory commission head who would support him in rejecting that. And so he finagled and got Obama to appoint Yatko, who was already known to be a critic of the nuclear power. And I guess that really tainted him from the get-go, because he encountered so much opposition. And what he eventually said as the outcome, he never took a position against nuclear power, of course, while he was running the place. But his conclusion is it's not possible to make it safe, because he said the regulatory commission is so much at the mercy of lobbyists in the industry, and they are constantly pressuring their congressmen and other people to pressure people like him to overlook flaws or possible dangers, and because it's costly to fix them. And so he said he eventually concluded that he couldn't regulate it and nobody could regulate it, that there are safety flaws in there, and it's quite unpredictable where they're going to be. But even when you can predict them, he was not able to actually carry out the remedies that he understood were required.
You have to add what Yatko is doing right now. He runs a renewable energy company.
He has a company of what kind?
I think it's focused on wind, but he basically runs I'm not sure. He doesn't write much about that, but I know he runs a company. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I didn't ask him what he's doing now. We just talked about his book and his conclusions. But
Meta, I think I may be the only one here who's actually been inside Yucca Mountain, which, although it was 20 years ago when I was taking a long research look into waste questions. And while it was certainly an impressive piece of engineering, I certainly came away not very convinced that the idea of concentrating all of the nuclear waste of an entire country in one site and shipping it across the country by train cars was a very wise idea.
Mm-hmm. He claims
that I could certainly see his thinking there. Although I did come away convinced that leaving it where it is and eventually reprocessing it was a smaller problem. And certainly the people were scared then around 1999, 2000 that there'd be terrorist attacks on waste pools at plants and that sort of thing, which didn't end up materializing.
Yeah, well, but
I think I talked to him during that process and was interested in his later positions. Yeah.
Well, he said that the real enemy is water, and he said even in the desert in Yucca Mountain, they found that there could be water that would reach it, and therefore corrode any pipes and expose the stuff. So you never know. You cannot predict what's going to be safe 100,000 years from now. Anyway, I interrupted Ramana. You were ready to leap upon somebody.
No. I was just going to say that, I think storage, trying to deal with renewable variability, storage is sort of, by using batteries, is something which is still evolving, right? Right now, looks like the cheapest way seems to be using, apart from pumped hydro storage. I'm talking about batteries itself. The best known technology today is lithium-ion batteries. Partly because of all our laptops and other things and cars. And, there's no problem in terms of scaling it up, right? The question is whether that's the sensible way to do it. And unfortunately, with renewables, there is no one size that fits all solution, right? So Canada is really blessed in that there's so much hydropower that it can operate as a good backup. There are other parts of the world where that may not happen. So one place which is actually doing surprisingly well on ramping up battery storage technology, or at least buying, is Australia, surprisingly, right? For a country that's so dependent on coal, it's also really ramping up on solar power, and they're finding that they need to back up the solar power, and they don't want to use coal because it actually doesn't make sense, right? For the reason that I mentioned, it's a base load source. So Australia has been procuring some of the large contracts from, especially from Tesla, but from other places as well. And just last week, the head of the Australian energy market operator, which is sort of responsible for maintaining the grid, has said that by 2025, he wants the country's main grids to be handled periods when there'll be 100% renewables, right? They're already hitting 50, 60% quite regularly at this point. So they are actually ramping up quite a lot. So it's, I mean, at some point, the challenge becomes one of, when you're trying to, in the storage space, there are so many ideas out there, right? All kinds of, everybody and their brother in the material science field has their pet battery idea. And we don't know which of these technologies is actually going to be working in the long run, but also because storage is not one thing, right? You use storage sometimes for frequency backup, you use storage sometimes for handling small fluctuations, and then the point which you're making, which is that you have sometimes long-term grid level storage which you require, might be a scale-up of one of these technologies, or might be something completely different, right? And nobody wants to, at this point, bet that one technology is going to work and spend the billions of dollars to kind of ramp up production really rapidly, right? Everybody's sort of doing a little bit of this. So I don't know the answer to that question. I don't think, I mean, frankly, compared to your previous guest, I think dealing with intermittency is a problem. It's not simple, right? I don't want to minimize that. But I also don't think that nuclear is a good solution, or carbon capture and storage and fossil fuels is a good solution to this problem, right? There are other ways by which you can deal with it. Sorry, Susan.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to come back to something that Doug mentioned really briefly. I didn't know if we were going to get into this, but you kind of suggested that an alternative to the deep geological repository is on-site storage and eventual reprocessing. And the reprocessing is something that I've been looking into and actually writing about the last 6 months, I guess, because in fact, that's what's being proposed for New Brunswick is to build a mini reprocessing facility on the Point Lepreau site on the Bay of Fundy. That's why I have the Bay of Fundy behind me.
Yeah, that's supposedly one of the assets of sodium plants, isn't it? That they can be used as reprocessing and breeder reactors.
Well, that's a bit, what's happening is that Moltex, I'm sure you're familiar with that name, which is one of the companies, it was actually the company that has had the biggest federal grant so far, 50.5 million for its project, which is to build two things, but what they're focusing on the first is this mini reprocessing facility. There's actually two facilities, Doug. One is the reactor and one is the mini reprocessing. So it doesn't have to be a molten salt or whatever. It just, the reprocessing is separate. But there's huge problems with it, both in terms of nuclear weapons proliferation and also the environmental potential cost and the unknown factors in terms of the new liquid waste streams that it produces and what's going to happen to them. But I just wanted to point out that your colleague at the Globe and Mail, Matthew McLaren, 2 months ago wrote an article in the business section about a letter that was written by signed by 9 non-proliferation experts in the US to Prime Minister Trudeau, raising concerns about the Moltex project on 2 points, and one of which was nuclear weapons proliferation. And unfortunately, that story just kind of died the next day, as these things tend to do.
Would be the concern in Canada with weapons proliferation?
Well, there's two concerns. I mean, I suppose, I mean, I don't know if you call it a minor concern, but there'd be a minor concern with making Point Lepreau a potential target for terrorism, which is always a concern. But I think that the concern that was raised by the US nuclear experts is the signal that it gives to the rest of the world, the green light, because the technology that Moltex is proposing to build at Point Lepreau on the Bay of Fundy is very, very similar, almost identical to the technology that South Korea has been proposing to use for more than a decade, I believe, and which has been, it's been kiboshed by the US government specifically because they do not want to create a situation where South Korea and certainly other countries would have the potential to extract plutonium from used nuclear fuel. And what Moltex is proposing, if the government, if in fact they can find the billions to build it, and if it actually works, and there's all kinds of questions about the cost, et cetera, to export this technology around the world. And this is exactly what the concern is. But I'm sure Ramana, as in his role as, in his expertise with weapons proliferation, he could say more about that.
Hmm.
No, I mean, I think the way to think about reprocessing is fairly simple. In nuclear reactors, as you know, the radioactive materials typically are produced and stay inside these fuel bundles or fuel rods, right? They are, so all of the fission products stay right there. And when the only thing you can do with that in a reprocessing plant is to take out the radioactive material and separate it out into a separate stream, right? So what was inside a solid form now gets distributed between various liquid streams and gaseous streams. So there's no way by which you can get rid of the radioactivity. That has to sort of die out on its own, whenever it does. Each of these fission products is different. So there's no net benefit, because ultimately the high-level waste that you produce in a reprocessing plant also has to be disposed of somewhere. It'll be another geological repository, right? And some of the claims that they make about how you would require a smaller size of repository, I have sort of two comments about that. The first is that the reason why no country has ever built so far a repository that's operating is not because of the high cost of real estate, right? You can always build a larger repository. The problem is that, there are technical uncertainties and there is social opposition, right? The second point is that the more technical point is that the size of the repository is actually a function of not the amount of radioactivity, but how much heat it gives off, because you have to make sure that the rock doesn't melt in the long run. And in order to do that, in the case of reprocessing waste, which is much more concentrated, you would actually have to space those, however you're going to store those containers more separately. So the size actually is not going to be a big difference. So bottom line is that I think reprocessing doesn't solve your nuclear waste problem, right? You still have to find a repository, and the repository size is not going to be that different. But in the process, what you're doing is you're increasing the proliferation risk. It's also extremely expensive, right? That's what happened in the case of the United States, that in the 1970s, after the Indian nuclear test of 1974, the US took a policy not to reprocess under the Carter administration. When President Reagan came to power, he said, proliferation, we're going to sort of do this. And he opened the possibility, but then nobody wanted to build one of these because it was commercially not viable, right? And that's, I think, going to be a completely different reality, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't think reprocessing is a solution to any of the problems with nuclear power. It probably makes it worse.
I talked to Frank von Hippel. I've talked to him a couple of times, and he has a book out, the thrust of which is simply, of all the things that we need to do about nuclear safety, the number one is to ban reprocessing everywhere. We want a treaty or something that absolutely prohibits reprocessing, because once you get the plutonium separated, it is a wonderful lure to all kinds of people who have nefarious intentions for how to use it for weapons and so on. So he claims that, if you have reprocessing going on in these small reactors, or you have them all over the world, reprocessing then just makes a huge number of targets for people to try to steal some. So
isn't reprocessing though, I mean, assuming that the number of nuclear power plants in the world is not going to go down, and will, or not by much, and therefore the amount of waste will continue to be a background issue. The alternative is either a lot more mining, and uranium mining is not a particularly nice practice and has its own ecological disadvantages, or it's increasing amounts of on-site storage. Aren't we going to end up with reprocessing as the solution eventually anyway? And is it better to, for example, I mean, given that India will probably be building a lot of nuclear, wouldn't it be wiser to get them to finally sign the non-proliferation treaty and agree not to use this stuff and to reprocess rather than have waste piling up?
I don't think it's true that nuclear power is going to continue. It is diminishing, and it's certainly not growing except in China, and there's reason to believe they're rethinking that. So in the US, at any rate, more plants are closing than are being built, by far, twice as many.
Also in the United States, yes.
But a lot of places.
I should say also in Western Europe.
Yeah. Okay.
As far as I understand, the problem we have with plutonium in the world is that there's too much of it. And again, I would defer to Ramana on this, but we have all this plutonium, and I mean, we don't know what to do with it. I guess there's the two choices. There's the MOX fuel, which is what they do in France, which is prohibitively expensive, but they're forced to do it, I guess. And then we have this pyroprocessing proposal, which is something else entirely. But I've sat through 2 presentations now by experts to the National Academy of Sciences in the US. They're doing a study of that, and they have some open consultations over the past few months. 2 experts who studied the cost of doing this, the exact process that is being proposed for New Brunswick. It's crazy. I mean, one of the figures I saw is that just to do 1 reactor load for the Moltex reactor, it was a figure of $40 billion just to reprocess the fuel required to do the 1 reactor load for a Moltex reactor. I mean, it's just crazy. So the cost of doing that is so prohibitive. I would definitely agree with Meta, just to go to shorthand, that I don't think this is going to happen. I think it's just completely out of the question that we're going to be building a whole bunch of new nuclear reactors. The problem is we could make a big mess in the meantime and waste a lot of money in the meantime.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. I think that nuclear is sort of a declining industry. If you look at the percentage of electricity that nuclear generates around the world, it's been declining continuously since the mid-90s, when it was about 17.5%. Now it's around 10%. And even in the most optimistic scenarios of the IAEA and so on, it'll at best maintain market share. Right? That will involve some increase, but it's not, I don't think, an issue. And uranium is not an issue. But if I sort of actually would like to, we said that we are not going to have an agenda, and then we sort of obsessed on this nuclear stuff. So I want to actually change the topic completely and maybe ask you, Doug, since it's the first time I'm talking to somebody from the Globe and Mail, I want to ask a little bit about how the media, sort of you can talk about your newspaper, maybe about other places, how they think of not just nuclear power, but climate change and all these changes that are sort of the energy system, how it has to adapt, right? And I see, for example, in many newspapers, there are articles which can be seen one way or the other, but it's usually what I find odd is that the people who are, shall we call them anti-nuclear, I don't think that's a fair description, but nevertheless anti-nuclear, would say, oh, this paper is so pro-nuclear. And then the pro-nuclear people always say, oh, the newspaper is very anti-nuclear because they keep bringing up these business of high costs and so on and so forth, right? How do you see sort of the media thinking about this issue?
I can't really speak about the Canadian media or the newspaper that publishes my work because I haven't written journalistically about media since the mid-1990s, and I haven't lived in the same country as the newspaper that I write for very much. So I don't know a lot about that specifically. But I think there's been a growing, the good news is, I think, that there's been a growing elite consensus, certainly in Western Europe and North America, even in the more conservative parts of that elite, toward a recognition that large-scale investments are going to be needed, both to keep warming down below 2 degrees over the next 50 years and to mitigate against whatever effects are produced by that warming, even without the catastrophes that have been hitting the world lately. So you have a different dialogue around that stuff, and I think we all look at the stuff on the edges, like the Fox Newses in the United States and the Bild tabloids in Germany and that sort of thing. But what I find interesting is that there tends to be a cross-party consensus around those things. The emerging conservative leaders in many countries are now behind it. I think Germany was an interesting example that way. So that elections in a lot of Western countries are no longer contests between an anti-ecological party of the right and a somewhat pro-ecological party of the left. Things like carbon pricing are now wide consensuses and so on. Again, the United States is an exception to this, and that disguises it. And that comes around in messaging too. But
Russia too. Russia is another exception.
Well, you can't really talk about them having an opposition either that's not in prison.
The official Russian position had been that global warming was going to be good for Russia because it was going to melt all this permafrost and let people have all this wonderful open land to use for agriculture. And oh my God, you wonder what was the matter with them in the first place. But now with the forest fires, they are saying, oh yes, I guess it is a bad thing. So
Yeah.
you have, I guess you can say that most of the press in Russia would follow whatever,
Well, part of my response to the nuclear question was governed by what I saw happen in Germany over the last 20 years, which was for the right in Germany under Merkel's Christian Democrats to turn very aggressively against nuclear power without having come out with a full-fledged solution or alternative. And they took an awful lot of nuclear offline without having an alternative. And as a consequence, we still have lignite power plants operating in Germany, some of the most polluting power plants in the world. And it still is quite a coal-dependent country for its electrical grid. And it's set 20 years behind in its emission targets.
I think that's
in large part because of that decision.
I think that's I've read somewhere that that's actually not entirely accurate. I don't know the details, but I've read somewhere that the nuclear industry has been pushing this as a fact, when in fact that's.
I don't think the nuclear industry has much to do with it in Germany because it's mainly a state-run thing. So there you can disagree about the numbers, but there's certainly
you hear it here, even in Canada. Look what happened in Germany, and I don't think that's.
I've looked at these numbers. I can sort of just reel off some of these things. So if you look at the International Energy Agency, which is by no means anti-nuclear or anything of that sort, they showed last year that the Germany's emissions had fallen, and I'm quoting, by 8% to 620 megatons of carbon dioxide, a level not seen since the 1950s, when the German economy was about 10 times smaller. And level 620 is down from 940 megatons in 1990. So it's about a 30% reduction, 33% reduction. And there was a small blip, right, between 2011 and 2013. And that really is not because they decided to shut down the nuclear plants and build coal plants. none of these things can be built overnight. What happened is that Germany, as you rightly point out, has had this long coal interest, shall we say, right? There are coal mining companies, and all of these large utilities, RWE and so on and so forth, Siemens and so on, they've all been invested in both coal and nuclear, right? So again, I want to sort of remind this thing that I think we should not see nuclear and coal as being opposed, right? The battle has been against renewables jointly. And Germany's, for better or for worse, they've sort of said, we want to get rid of both of them, right? And that's their long-term target. And last point I want to make is that their 2020 target, they actually met for emissions reductions, right? Which is better than many other countries, right?
But if I look at per capita CO2 emissions by European countries, Germany's has been unchanged at about 9 metric tons per person since about 1990. UK and France have plummeted since about 2010 down to about half that level in per capita.
I don't know where you're getting that number from, because of their overall emissions are growing down and their population is not reducing. How can their per capita emissions be the same?
Okay, well, they are the same. If the World Bank figures on that
what source of data you're using?
It's the World Bank figures on CO2 emissions per capita.
So is that from the electrical industry or from their global, or their total economy?
Total economy.
Yeah, so that's, I think, an issue, because you're talking about, we should talk about what is the emissions from the electrical industry rather than from the overall thing, because their economy has been doing relatively well. The UK has not been doing well. So there's a whole bunch of other things which are happening, right? And a lot of Germany's emissions today come from the transport sector, right? And from their heavy industry and so on and so forth. So they are very different things. The nuclear is not going to help you with any of those things either, right? Nuclear is a electricity solution. There are talks about, we can make hydrogen, we can do heat and so on and so forth. But at this point, no country is using nuclear for anything other than electricity in any reasonable size, right? So within the electricity sector, right, Germany's emissions have been declining and they continue to decline. And the reason they're declining is because their renewables have been getting ramped up, right? It is true, they're paying a lot of money for that compared to many of these other places, but somebody has to pay the money, because you want to, if you want to accelerate sort of renewables, somebody has to put up the initial cost for the learning to happen and the cost to decline. And Germany has done that. And now we are all benefiting from that in a way.
I want to ask you both about what needs to be done in terms of long-term solutions, because regardless, I imagine you don't particularly want to see countries falling back on coal.
Absolutely.
Simply in order to nominally say they haven't done nuclear. I mean, I would say obviously we need, in the medium term, we need to come up with a better way to convert matter into energy, because we're going to have a lot more demand for electricity, particularly since a lot of the carbon output is coming from heating of buildings. And if the next stage in meeting commitments is going to be shifting currently gas and oil heated buildings to electric heat, then aside from the increases in middle income countries caused by better quality of life and increasing demand, we're going to be seeing maybe a doubling of demand in higher income countries caused by the shifting of heating and so on. Yeah. What should we do? Should we be, I mean, Susan, should you, the experimental reactors are something that you make a case against. What should we be investing in terms of technologies, aside from storage, to more effectively convert matter into energy?
I'll just step back a question from that. I mean, we have to invest in energy conservation. There's no doubt about it, that the cheapest way of moving forward is to stop requiring that energy in the first place. And we have massive opportunities for doing that in New Brunswick through, for example, building retrofits, for example, just converting, reducing the amount of energy that's consumed by buildings. I would just refer you to, this is not my area of expertise, but Louise Como-Meta, I don't know if you know Louise, who's the energy expert at the Conservation Council of New Brunswick, is working on a cross-Canada project about electrification modeling. And I was just on a meeting with her this morning looking at some of the data that she has from Atlantic, for example. So Doug, I can't answer your question fully, but I would say the very first thing we have to do is a massive investment in energy conservation and retrofits to get down the requirements that we have for energy in New Brunswick. We're just a really small province. I mean, we have so many opportunities for doing it here. It's a lot easier to do what we need to do in New Brunswick than it is in Ontario, for example.
I could see that working in New Brunswick, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I have to say in Ontario, I was excited by the prospect of electric conversion. I mean, in Ontario, houses are heated mostly using gas forced air, which is better than some things, but is still, we can't be using that in 2050. So the prospect of replacing gas forced air with electric forced air, given that it's a no carbon grid almost, seems like a promising prospect until you realize an electric forced air furnace uses more electricity it uses something like 5 times as much electricity as every single thing in your house. And it uses it pretty much continuously all day. So a province like Ontario would need to double the size of its capacity. And that's an established, fairly stable, wealthy place. Converting India, where you have more than 1 billion people who are predominantly doing any heating that's required or cooking using gas cylinders and wood burning, to electric sources of cooking and heat and so on, at the same time as that population is going to be switching to private automobile use at a huge scale, which will hopefully be electric private automobile use, implies just absolutely huge amounts of generation capacity needed, particularly in lower and middle income countries.
Can I jump in? I know we are sort of almost out of time, so I just want to sort of say two very quick points. The first is the way, as a physicist, I sort of cringe when you say you have to convert matter to energy, right? That happens only in nuclear plants, right? Every other source of energy is converting one form of energy to another form of energy, all right?
In fossil plants?
No, there's no conversion there's no mass, there's no E equal to MC squared formula there.
This is my scientific illiteracy speaking. So the burning of a fossil fuel would not count as converting matter into energy. Okay.
No. What you're doing is it's a chemical reaction, right? So you're breaking some chemical bonds to convert into other chemical constituents. Sorry, that's just just being nitpicky as a physicist.
Fair enough.
The best places to invest today are in renewables and storage, right? And a much more larger term growth than that. I'd just add to that I think we need to also develop new ways of thinking, right? The old Max Planck, the physicist who invented quantum mechanics, he said physics changes not because everybody realizes the truth, but because an older generation dies off and a new generation comes in thinking about a different way of thinking, right? And I think we have to we need a newer generation of people who are thinking about how to model grids with renewables, how to sort of construct the world in a way that is concomitant with ecological limits in a more broader sense.
That's a great way to wind up. I've learned so much today. I keep thinking I've already exhausted the subject of energy because I've done so many shows about it. But I tell you, everyone is different, and I always learn something more. So I hope other people are getting as much benefit from these as I am. And I thank you all very much. It's been fun and very enlightening. Thanks very much.
It was great to meet you, Doug, and nice to see you.
Doug.
Thanks for the invite, Meta. Thanks.
Okay, great. Bye-bye.